Data sovereignty has been picking up a lot of momentum recently because people are becoming increasingly concerned about their reliance on, let's say, foreign owned data stores or foreign owned infrastructure where data is processed.
I'm Michael Murphy, and I'm the Deputy CTO at Arkit.
Data sovereignty really is about your data and knowing where it is and knowing who has control over it. So they're the two really important parts, but it comes about because people are more and more thinking about data as something which they need to hold in a certain geographic location, maybe because of compliance, but also they're thinking about how do I make sure that even when it's in that geography, I retain, as the owner of that data or as the custodian of that data, I retain full control over that. Data sovereignty has been picking up a lot of momentum recently because people are becoming increasingly concerned about their reliance on, let's say, foreign owned data stores or foreign owned infrastructure where data is processed. There's lots of reasons for that. One of them is because geopolitically, we are in a period of quite a lot of flux. Lots of things are changing, and the understandings that we used to have about the way that organizations would operate within a state are changing in many ways, sometimes for the better, and sometimes not so much. And in both of those scenarios, it just causes people to rethink what it means for them to have real control over their data wherever it is. Some good examples are driven by regulation. So particularly in the European Union, they've had for a very long time data privacy regulation like the GDPR, which places constraints over where data can live, how it needs to be handled. And each of the member states also interprets that legislation in their own way as well. So they have additional controls, or they will apply additional controls for their own state. But of course, the reality is that organizations who operate within these states have to, yes, of course, abide by those rules, but they also want to take advantage of the kind of global offering in terms of different technology players, cloud providers, functionality that's available maybe across borders. And so they're constantly having to worry about, how do I make sure that I'm compliant with some of these regulations while still being able to take advantage of all of these great things that are available to me if I was able to kind of go across a border or work with an organization which technically is domiciled within a different state. The other side of it is that more and more, I would say, organizations are being driven out of their traditional, let's say, on-premise or fully controlled environments that they may have created over many years. We know many organizations have been moving to the cloud now, migrating to the cloud for many, many years and have invested a lot of money in doing that. And maybe they didn't think so much in advance about what were all the repercussions of that, again, in terms of that data sovereignty perspective. How sure can I be about how well my data is being taken care of? How sure can I be that my data is not going to be either maliciously or inadvertently shared with someone who I don't want to have access to it? AI is one of the factors in causing organizations to think harder about how they're using cloud, because frankly, if you want to take advantage of the latest models, the latest tools, you want the scalability, the only place to really find that today is in the cloud. And the big hyperscalers are buying up a lot of the GPU, for example, the compute that you need in order to be able to affect some of these workloads. So through that lens, again, it's one of the things that is driving organizations more and more to putting sensitive workloads, putting sensitive data into the cloud because they want to take advantage of that. And that's, again, exacerbating some of those data sovereignty issues. I think on the flip side, of course, data sovereignty is changing the way that we work, and it's changing in our field as a software vendor. It's changing the way we even build our software, and it's changing the way that we think about the threats that exist when we deploy software, for example, in the cloud, because things are changing very rapidly and we're generating lots more features and lots more code. and you can't be as certain as maybe you once were about the security of all of that before it's deployed. So things become much more reactive, and things become much more about monitoring and about making sure that you have the right guardrails around what you're doing. And so that again raises additional concerns about, well, once data is gone, once it's lost, once it's been exfiltrated, it's gone forever. So you can't kind of accept those risks. So that again is making people think more about what it means to put these kind of workloads in the cloud. The kind of organizations that this is probably most important for are what I would call highly regulated and data rich. So highly regulated meaning that they work in a space like financial services or healthcare, where there are already lots of controls around data, access to data, and the use of public cloud. They are also in many cases very data rich, and the data that they hold is typically not just valuable to them in terms of the value they create, but also it's valuable to the customers maybe that have provided it. So in healthcare, that data is your data. It's the individual patient's data. And of course, that would be could be catastrophic for me as an individual if my data through a healthcare provider was to be exfiltrated or leaked out in some way. And also organizations that do just have that very large volume of very, very valuable data, which they want to somehow turn into value. They want to mine it, they want to process it, they want to apply AI technology to it, LLMs, etc., in order to be able to extract value. So I think they are probably the ones that feel it the most today. Ultimately, though, I think this is a problem for any organization which is using what I would describe as foreign-owned infrastructure for running their workloads, which is their intellectual property, and also any organization which is using data and managing data in the cloud, which extends to a much larger number than the ones I mentioned at the beginning. So I think that there is this ultimately will reach many more organizations, but we're certainly starting in that highly regulated, data rich space. In terms of what organizations can do about it today, I think there are two quite different options for organizations, and I don't believe either of them are particularly great. One is that you can try and use more of the controls that the cloud providers themselves are putting on top of their services. These typically come with a reasonable uplift in cost, and they're also reasonably complex for you to manage. We're all very familiar, if you're in cloud, with things like the shared responsibility model, and this hasn't changed in this scenario. So you're still responsible as an organization for your own use and security of these tools. So that hasn't gone away. That also has the downside that you have to trust the cloud vendor. You have to believe that they are able to protect even themselves from your data and from your workloads. On the flip side, you have something called sovereign cloud, which essentially means that an organization which is maybe more local to you in your geographic region or within your jurisdiction has created what they hope to be a facsimile of the cloud in many ways. So same functionality, same feature set, but it can be proven, or it is, operationally and legally under a different jurisdiction to the cloud vendors, which is typically, would be a US-based or a Chinese-based cloud vendor. And that's quite appealing on the one hand, because you could say, well, I get all the benefits of the cloud, but I get to consume it through a local entity where I know it's going to be subject to the laws of that local region. The downside of it is, again, cost. These sovereign cloud offerings are typically much more expensive than the hyperscalers, and they do not have feature parity. And they cannot have feature parity because, again, they do not have the buying power that the CSPs, the cloud service providers, have. And so as an organization, if you're going to choose that option, you have to then accept that, well, yes, I might have more control over sovereignty, but I don't have as good access to the functionality that I was getting in the cloud. One of the options that you have in public cloud is a technology called confidential compute. And this is a great technology because one of the things that allows you to do is to encrypt data while it's in use. So typically, if you're running your application in the cloud, the memory that's being used by that application is in principle readable and available to the cloud host, which means that any data you're processing, again, that really valuable healthcare data or financial service information, could in principle be seen by the cloud vendor. And confidential compute is a technology that helps prevent that. So essentially what it does is it puts an envelope, a container around your workload and around your data while it's being processed. And it means from the outside, the only thing that people can see is what looks to be a kind of encrypted blob, and meaning everything inside of there is still running as you intended, but from the outside, nobody can see that, and there's no way that any of that data could therefore leak out. And it's available, for example, through Intel, who's one of our partners. But it's only one facet of security when it comes to data sovereignty, because what it allows you to do is important, that data in use aspect, but you still have to worry about the other forms that data can be in, namely data at rest. So when I store data in a database or manage object storage or some other kind of on-disk solution in the cloud, let's say, I have to take care of that. And I also have to worry about data when it's moving in transit between containers or between one cloud environment and another, or between someone's client device and the cloud. And that's really where organizations like Arkit come in, because what we're interested in is not just taking these technologies and putting them together, and obviously, of course, adding our own technology around encryption and cryptography of data in transit, but also to make it as easy as possible for organizations to adopt data sovereign technologies, and to make it as seamless as possible within the architecture that you're likely already developing or have already developed and deployed into the cloud. So we don't think it's right to expect organizations to completely reevaluate their entire architecture or to change the way that they're using the cloud. We want to enable people to use the cloud, but we want to provide that third party, that kind of disinterested perspective that we have as Arkit, in order to help customers get the most data sovereign outcome for themselves and their business without losing that functionality. So in terms of what I think CISOs, for example, should be thinking about now when it comes to sovereignty, the very first thing I would say is just to really give it some thought. What does sovereignty mean? What does sovereignty mean to you and to your organization? What is your reliance on organizations, on technologies, which you may not actually have a huge amount of control over? That would be the first thing I would say. Really think hard about that, and think about it as well in the context of kind of the disaster scenario of, what if I was to lose access to that technology? What if I was to lose access or control over this data? What would it mean? And I think that would already start to raise some red flags, some concerns for organizations when they really start to think hard about that. And then the second thing I would say is, some of the advice out there would say, the only way to achieve true sovereignty is to migrate off the cloud and to move everything on-prem, or to start creating your own technological advantage and, trying to build your own version of the cloud. And there might be, for some organizations, some merit in doing that. There might be, even for some specific workloads that you have, some merits in doing that. But I would say, look very hard, at that and decide whether that's really right for you or not. And think about the investment that you've made in public cloud, very likely over the last few years, and ask yourself whether you're really prepared now to reverse some, if not all of that. And I would just encourage you to remember that it may not even be necessary to doing that, because there are ways, there are technologies, and there are products and companies like Arkit who can help you stay in the cloud, but maintain all that functionality, while also asserting your sovereign control over your data